We're in Assynt in northwest Scotland. Behind me here is Loch Assynt, which gives the parish its name. It's a very beautiful place, the whole of the parish, and a very dramatic landscape, as you can see. And it attracts very, very many visitors. A lot of Europeans come here because they see it in many ways as the last wilderness they can visit in Europe. In fact, it's been called very often the last wilderness in Europe. And they see it as a very natural environment with the mountains, the lochs, the trees on the hillside, the 2 or 3 people living on farms. But in fact, it's been very heavily influenced by man. It's very much a managed landscape, even up here. For example, we're sitting here in the middle of a cleared village, and this is just one of a number of villages which are right through this valley. This is the ruin of one of the Crofter's houses in this village here. It's one of 10 or 12 such ruins. Very small space, as you can see. It's got a turf roof on it. There's no windows, no chimney, just an earthen floor here, which in the wet conditions would be quite wet, quite muddy. There'd be a peat fire sitting in the middle here. So you can imagine 5 people living in this very small space in tremendously difficult conditions in the winter time with high rainfall. We've about 2 meters of rain fall in this area here up in the mountains through the winter months. Long dark days, there's only about 6 hours of daylight, and they're all sharing this space. And as if that wasn't going to be difficult enough, they would very often have to bring the cow in to shelter it in the wintertime as well. Of course, there are many crofters still in Assynt today, of which I'm one, but clearly we don't live in conditions like that, as I've just described to you. Our conditions are quite different. One of the things we do have in common is that we do a number of different jobs, and many of these are seasonal. In the past, the crofters might well have gone away to the fishing, herring fishing, or away to work on East Coast farms. In my case, of course, I'm a fisherman, a lobster fisherman, and a countryside ranger in the summertime. And both these jobs take me off the croft. But of course, the croft is very important to us. It's a very important source of food and income, and the work has to go on a daily basis in all weathers, the cultivating the land, the feeding the livestock, and that very often is the central role of the crofter's wife. Telecommunications is providing a whole new range of opportunities. It seems to make sense to me when I'm getting a wee bit older to look for work on the croft, which is perhaps less physically demanding. At the moment, I'm able to communicate with fellow crofters and other organisations I work with in a much more efficient and direct way without having to leave the croft, and that's making a big difference. Crofting is often seen as a relic of subsistence living, but it's not. In fact, it's a very good example of trying to live off the land and the sea in a non-intensive, sustainable way. By sustainable, I mean living off the interest of the land and the sea without destroying these very valuable assets. Nothing is truly sustainable. What you can try and do is use your primary resources as sustainable as practical. By that I mean your land, the fertility of the land, the wildlife the land produces. And of course in the sea, where we're not actually interfering with it, it's actually producing biological material, plants and animals in the sea which we can use. And provided we don't disturb the production system, the water, the state of the water, and so on, then that should be able to keep a sustained production going, and we should reap that harvest. I think lobster fishing is a very good model of how we should use the sea in the future. By putting the small and breeding lobsters back into the sea, we should be able to catch lobsters far into the future. And if we can, the sea should provide us and be useful to us in a sustainable way, virtually forever. Fishing, on the whole, is very competitive. It's what you would call the last of the hunters. It introduces a slight element of risk into the game as well, because it's bad enough just fishing your own gear close to the rocks, especially lobster fishing, where you're fishing hard on the rocks. And this means the ropes that you're trying to pick up are very close to the rocks, so it's quite dangerous. In fact, earlier this year I had a pretty close thing. I was fishing lobsters in a pretty stiff wind, and the ropes were lying very close to the rocks. And the strength of the wind blew the boat onto the rock, and a surge picked it up and sat it right on top of the rock. I put a life jacket on, I was ready to abandon the boat, but fortunately it was a rising tide. And just as the tide lifted the boat, I gave her hard ahead, and she did in fact drag herself off the rocks, but not before she hauled herself. Part of the skill of lobster fishing, of course, is not catching lobsters, but in fact, manoeuvring your boat. In fact, the greatest skill, to be honest with you, is not the catching of the lobster, but actually manoeuvring your boat to the grounds where the lobsters are in a safe way and making that kind of judgment. That is far more demanding in terms of working out what's going on than actually catching the lobster.
This time, well, mind you, if we had two like this in every creel, we'd be a rich man right enough. Very nice. Nice size of lobster. Here, this is how they swim. They use this flipping action you saw when I took them out to swim. That's what this big muscle is developed for. And these legs, of course, are just for crawling about. So they crawl about in that form, and then when they're swimming, they streamline themselves. These go out front, and this big muscle pulls very, very fast. And I'm going to have to move this boat. Oh, we're taking the sea temperatures. I do this on a daily basis for Newcastle University. I just do it as an amateur because I live here locally, but it's interesting. We've got about 12 degrees today, which is pretty cold. I wouldn't like to go for an early morning dip in it. This storm that's brewing is in fact a massive warm air from the Gulf Stream area coming up and crashing into a great wad of cold air up near the Atlantic. And that's giving rise to this pressure which is hurtling into the northwest and bringing a storm here. Oh, this is serious. This is a big sea running by anybody's standard, no doubt about it. We've got a full storm blowing. There's probably a mean wind speed of something like, I don't know, 50, 60 mile an hour. And for sure she's been gusting through to 80 mile an hour. That's nearly hurricane force. And what I've got here, out here on that point, I would say the only person that's going to come out of this all right is the creel manufacturers.
For 2 winters now we have had exceptionally bad gales, and not just severe gales, but lots of them. And it's certainly knocked a big hole in the earnings of the fishermen. And if this was to be a change in pattern, if the talk about global warming and the greenhouse effect is going to increase storms like this, then it will be very serious for fishing, because these storms are blowing up in the height of fishing season.
Look at this. Whoa! You would say they like it. Oh, well, here's a sure sign of the strength of that storm. This is seaweed driven in. Just driven in and filled the creel up. It's a fearful weight. Seaweed and sand, shells. See a lobster in it too. I don't know if they've survived. But this is just going to be the pattern, I'm afraid, for the fishing trip. The strength of that storm we saw yesterday was just horrendous. And you can see, though there's not a lot of wind today, there's a big motion in the sea. Everything is being driven in towards the rocks. Everything is just big jabble on the sea here. We'll just see it. see if these guys have survived. They must be glad to be out. I'll tell you, well, not to knew where they were going, I suspect. They should survive in the keep till the next market. In fact, you know, they'll probably recover quite well. So I'm just going to put them in the keep box with the rest of them. This one here, my eye tells me that it may not quite be big enough, so I'm going to measure it. There's a minimum legal size, which is 85 millimeters across the carapace here, from the back of the eye to the back of the shell, what we call the carapace here. And we're not allowed to land them any smaller than 85, so I'm just going to check it. With a gauge here, which I've got set at 85 millimeters. I'll just place that into the eye, and we can see it's a bit slack here, showing that it's under the legal limit. So he's got to go back in. He's alive. He'll survive, and hopefully by next year he'll be a legal size. I'll catch him again. We're close enough to the rocks here for him to go back into a hole. So we don't throw him in. We just put him in, and he'll swim away quite happily. Hopefully to be caught again. Part of my job as a ranger is to look after Achmelvig Beach here. As you can see, it's a very popular place with the visitors coming from all over Europe. And most of them, in fact about 70% of them, come here year after year. And this has allowed them to build up a sympathy for this environment, which is just as well, because it's actually a very fragile environment. Improved roads has led to much easier access, and this has brought with it
increasing numbers of people to these remote areas throughout the Highlands and Islands. This has brought new pressures to these very fragile landscapes. And one of the things we've had to do is to try management measures in an area like this so that the visitor doesn't destroy the very thing he's come to enjoy.
The reason this beach area is so fragile is the sand. Unlike most beaches where the sand is made up of ground-up rocks, the sand here is made up of ground-up shells. Millions of shells ground up over a long period of time, and it's very light. And when we get the strong winds, storms blowing in from the sea, it just blows the sand right up into the mountains there. And if the winds are blowing from the east, of course it can blow the sand right out again. We've planted this marram here in an attempt to stabilize it, but even so, the pressure of visitors can cause quite an impact. Here we have an example of the visitor impact on the dune system. The people have cut a track through here on their way to the beach. Fortunately, most of them are aware of the problem and stick with them on track, and we can handle that. Similarly with litter. I mean, obviously we get a bit of litter, but we don't have a litter problem. Most people are aware that we don't have a litter collection here, and being very sympathetic with this environment, they take the litter away with them.
Since becoming a ranger, I've found that the tourists appreciate the area better if they understand some of the dynamic processes which create the landscape here and the wildlife in it.
We've had a look at some of the erosion problems on the beach itself behind us. But moving up here, we can see that there's a lot of erosion activity as well. You'll see the effect of the erosion coming through from the prevailing winds here. At some point, it's cut through this mound of sand, it's blowing the sand right up through these rocks there, and you can see that escarpment here, this sharp face of erosion, that will slowly work its way up the face here, and you can see 1, 2, 3 layers of it, 3 levels of it. And we're going to walk over here now and have a look where it goes through the gully here, and we'll look at a bit more detail at that.
Living and working so close to the land and the sea as I do, I probably know this area, its rocks, its plants, its animals, better than anybody. But I keep learning more and more, and I get a great pleasure out of taking people out and showing them what I've discovered.
This is the gap in the rocks we pointed to from down there. An interesting feature of these rocks are their age. They're among the oldest rocks in the world, and certainly the oldest in Europe, at about 2,900 million years old, which is about 3/4 of the way back into the known history of the Earth, which is a long, long way back. It's an interesting thought that the sand, which is being blown back into the sea down here, is beginning to form the newest rocks. They will form into limestones eventually, whereas these rocks have been around for all that length of time.
The area around Achmervig is very rich in plants and wildlife. Most areas of the Highlands are covered in a peaty soil, which is very acidic and nutrient poor. Here we've got the beneficial effects of the blowing sand. The shell sand, which is very alkaline, is blown up onto the hills and into the lochans, neutralising the very acid conditions and making the area, including the lochan and, fortunately for me, the soils of my croft, more fertile.
We've come some way in from the beach now to this little lochan, which you can see is very rich in vegetation. A lot of animals take advantage of that, including many of the bigger mammals. In this area here, we've got fox, badger, otter, roe deer, red deer, pine marten, virtually all living within sight of you here. And myself, a crofter, just alongside them here. The reason that most of these animals can live together like this is that they hunt different things in different places at different times of the day. And so for the most part, they're not in competition. They can live quite well together.
Of course, when animals, and that includes man, hunt for the same food, there's an element of competition, and that can lead to friction.
Speaking of some of the other boats, the fishing's very poor indeed. The prawn fishing, without doubt, is getting more and more difficult. The catches are getting less and less. Since the limit was taken away on trawling, the 3-mile limit, which used to forbid trawling in the bay here, boats are now trawling the ground here, dragging heavy gear across the bottom, and in my opinion are definitely upsetting the ground that the prawns are breeding on. The prawns live in mud, and when we set creels, as you'll see in a minute, which is a trap, it just sits on the bottom and catches the prawn without disturbing the ground the prawn is living in. Trawler, on the other hand, actually drags gear across the bottom of the sea. It seems to me that must do damage. I've got to put these gloves on because this time of year We have a lot of jellyfish, great big scalders, and they'll come up on the ropes. And we've got a right hot potch here, apart from a scalder, which is going to make taking things out of this creel rather difficult. Didn't have that the last time around. We've also got a creel full of starfishes, the small crab. These starfishes seem to be really on the increase, especially in the areas that have been trawled. Seems to me anyway that taking the prawns out in large quantities must be upsetting the balance of animals in the bottom of the sea. And certainly when you come onto the trawl ground, you find lots and lots of these starfishes getting into the creels with no prawns. It's almost as if they'd occupied an area that at one time were full of prawns. Well, we're not having much luck so far. I suspect, frankly, they've been down too long, and the predators have been managing to go through the creels and eat what was in them. Aha! The very thing. Here we got a predator been running through the creels here. An octopus who's wrapping himself around the creel, who's been in, and you can see that he's made a good job eating the prawns that were in here, completely emptied them out. They're quite capable of working their way through a whole string of creels and eating the prawns as they go. In fact, he's one of the main competitors to myself fishing, really. If the gear's down too long, these boys, move in and really can work right through a fleet of creels. They do change colour sometimes against the background. I'm going to try and see if I put him on this, put a red here, see if, there he goes. See the change in colour? They can quite capable of blending in with their background. And he's gone bright red to match the quarterdeck here.
In order to put gear on and off my boat, I've got to be able to steam it up to the head of the loch where the river comes in. And I then have to transfer everything by a small boat up to a small landing place, or a small bridge crosses the river there. I can only do that in high tide. I've got about an hour on either side of high tide, so I've only got twice in the day when I can do that. But interestingly, the tides also affect the fishing. The fishing itself, I don't know what happens, but the fish do respond to the tides. We get a far better fishing. We catch more shellfish on a making strong tide, that is, the few days up until the full moon or the new moon. When the tides are at its strongest, the fish seem to move better, the shellfish. Both lobsters and prawns definitely seem to move, and therefore are more easily caught, of course, during the strong tides. In periods of slack tides, at the neap tides, there's much less movement for some reason or other, and catches are much poorer as a result. There just does seem to be a much bigger shellfish market in Europe than in Britain. The bulk of that goes to Spain, and because they just have a much bigger demand for shellfish over there. I mean, it's really seen as I don't know how it's an affordable delicacy. I can never work this out. I mean, I know what I get paid for it, so what it's like when it hits the table in Spain, I can't imagine. But somebody out there is eating it. I have a sneaking suspicion it's a whole lot of British holidaymakers who think they're eating local produce. I can't imagine who else can afford to buy it. But anyway, that's where it all goes. The produce from the croft is grown organically, which means that we use the natural fertilisers around us, the shell sand, the seaweed, and of course the manure and the compost produced on the croft. This means we don't have to use chemical fertilisers. I think this has several benefits. It leaves the soil in good condition, and of course it makes economic sense, as these natural fertilisers are produced on a sustainable basis and cost me nothing except a bit of sweat. I would say that we can grow the same quantity as conventional farming, but of course the main difference is in the quality, the taste.
Well, as you can see, red deer like organic cabbages as well. Looks like we've had a stag in here. There's big footprints lying around here, and as you can see, they've been eating the heart out of some of these cabbages. Normally, of course, we like to see the wildlife around here, but occasionally we do come into conflict, and on occasion like this, we've got to do something about it. Red deer are definitely on the increase. Recent surveys by the Red Deer Commission show that quite clearly, and that's creating several problems. They're putting pressure on the arable land of crofters and farmers as their numbers expand, and also they're stopping a lot of natural regeneration. And the problem is that red deer don't have any natural predators anymore except man, and of course the control over the hunting of red deer is very strict. The most important thing on the stock is to get into a distance where you can get what we call a clean shot. Otherwise the risk is that you'll wound the animal,
He'll get away, and you won't be able to catch it and kill it. And nobody wants to do that. The idea is to get as close in as you can to get a clean shot. And that means trying to work out, in the first place, where the deer are likely to be, so that you can approach the area with caution, work out the terrain, work out the wind directions, and to get into, if you can, about 100 meters. Though red deer are wild animals, and nobody actually owns them, they're what we call game, and only certain people have the right to shoot them. But of course, if they maraud onto my land, if they come into my land, jump the fences, and eat the vegetables like we've seen there, then of course that gives me the right to treat them as a pest, and to shoot that marauding animal. It might seem strange that someone like me who really does love the wildlife around me, and in fact takes people out to see that wildlife, should go out and shoot a deer. But really, it's all a matter of balance between my needs and the resources about me. In the case of deer, where we can see the numbers, we know the number of deer about, we can actually go out and manage that. We can get the balance right. But when it comes to hunting in the sea, and we can't actually see the resource, then it's obviously much more difficult. We've got to learn to read much more subtle signs, drop-in catches, things like that. If I'm catching less lobsters, what does this mean? Does this mean that I'm taking too many? And if we're too greedy, if we don't, as it were, react to these signs correctly, then the results could be disastrous. Fortunately, we really are much more aware of the need to get this balance right, to try and manage our resources in a sustainable way. And the land, we now recognise we've got to keep the land in good heart, that we can't just take from it without putting something back into it. And this applies to the sea and all our resources.